They arrived in the dust of early morning before the sun had fully risen over the hills. Just 3 women in worn sandals veils, tugged by the wind faces, lit by something more enduring than confidence faith. Sister Ida, Sister Mora, and Sister Dorothy. They carried no weapons, no armor but their rosaries, no shield but their belief that light somehow could walk straight into the dark without being swallowed. In December of 1980, El Salvador wasn't just a country on edge. It was a wound torn wide open, bleeding distrust, violence, disappearances. A place where silence wasn't peace, it was permission. Where buses were stopped by masked men and passengers dragged out without names ever spoken again. Still, the 3 nuns came. From Cleveland, from New York, from places where winter snow fell softly on churches, not ash from gunfire or burning homes. They came anyway. And then they vanished. No goodbye. No witnesses. No trace, no clue, no calls. Only a radio that went quiet. Only a Jeep that didn't return. Only a silence that rang so loud it shook the faith of everyone who loved them. But 43 years later, in a small, crumbling chapel high in the mountains, hidden behind a wall, someone found a cassette tape, wrapped in cloth, pressed flat behind bricks. It wasn't marked. No label, no handwriting. Just the sound of something left behind, a whisper maybe from a time when no one dared to speak at all. This is the story of what happened before the tape. The echoing footsteps that led to that wall, and the silence that tried for 4 decades to bury the truth. They were not political, not spies, not soldiers, just women of conviction. Dorothy Kazel, 40 years old. Straight-backed, Cleveland-born eyes, always searching for who was hurting and how she could help. She had been here for years. The dust had become part of her, the way she walked, the way she breathed, the way she refused to look away. She taught children how to read, held mothers whose sons had been taken, smuggled medicine to villages the government forgot. Maura Clark, older, 49, with a face marked by both kindness and exhaustion. She had served in Nicaragua before the war came to El Salvador. She knew what it meant to watch soldiers enter a town and leave it empty of sound. Still, she followed the call, and Ida Ford, 40. A late vocation, just a year into her mission. Fragile looking, but not fragile at all. A kind of stillness that felt like thunder held inside. She had once nearly drowned in a flash flood, and yet chose to return to the very same country, the very same violence, because she believed her place was among the people whose lives could end without anyone knowing. They weren't rebels. They didn't carry rifles. But they were in the eyes of a government at war with its own people dangerous. Because they showed up. Because they listened. Because they remembered names. And in places where terror lives, remembering is the most dangerous thing you can do. December 2nd, 1980. A dirt airstrip just outside San Salvador. The plane landed hard, jolting on impact. Ita and Maura stepped out, faces damp with sweat, exhausted, but smiling. Dorothy was waiting in a white Jeep, and the kind that made too much noise in the countryside. There was a young lay missionary with them, Jean Donovan, just 27 years old, blonde hair tied back, engaged to be married. But she had chosen to stay behind when the other Americans left, because children were still dying in the hospitals, because someone had to witness what was happening. The Jeep pulled away from the strip tires, skidding on gravel. And that was the last anyone saw them alive. It was less than an hour's drive to the mission house in La Libertad. They never arrived. No calls came, no radio chatter, no lights from the Jeep crawling up the dusty hillside like usual. By morning, the absence had teeth. The priest who expected them began pacing the narrow hall. He called other parishes, waited, called again. Nothing. It wasn't like them. They always checked in. Always. By noon the next day, a search began quiet, at first careful. Too loud and it would draw attention. And attention in El Salvador in 1980 was dangerous currency. It was a boy who found them. On the side of a rural road near El Paisnal, where banana palms grow thick and low. He had been walking to find his uncle cutting through the brush when he saw the shallow pit. Disturbed earth, buzzards circling above like black punctuation. Their bodies had been buried hastily, carelessly, as if even in death they weren't afforded dignity. Dug up by dogs overnight, half-covered hands still bound. No documents, no shoes. But even the military couldn't scrub the truth from a face. The local priest knew them by heart. 4 women, all missionaries, all shot at point-blank range. Their families never got a call, just a report. Just the press-cold and formulaic American nuns killed in violent incident. The word murder was avoided, so was execution. But the bodies said what the reports wouldn't. Jean Donovan's journal was recovered later. Her last entry read, "Several times I've decided to leave El Salvador. I almost could, except for the children, the poor bruised victims of this insanity. Who would care for them if we left? What kind of people would we be?" The world did take notice. Briefly. The U.S. State Department issued a statement. The Salvadoran government, under pressure, arrested 5 National Guardsmen. They confessed, then recanted, then were convicted decades later. Not for the murders, but for the embarrassment they caused. And that could have been the end of it. It was for a time. The war in El Salvador swallowed everything. Schools, churches, names. By the time peace returned in the 1990s, the world had moved on. New wars, new headlines. The names of the women, Ida Mara, Dorothy Jean, lingered only in small chapels and worn in pages of missionary newsletters. But there was something no one knew. Something never entered into court documents. Something not found in witness testimonies or military archives. Something that pulsed behind a wall hidden away in a mountain chapel that hadn't seen Mass in years. A tape, found by accident. A mason hired to stabilize the old chapel wall knocked a brick loose. Inside, behind cracked plaster and spider webs, was a bundle. A cloth hand-stitched, tied with twine, hardened by time. The priest who ran the project almost threw it away. But something about the bundle, the deliberate folding, the tenderness of it, stopped him. He took it home, opened it, inside a cassette. Blank. No label. Just tape brittle with age. It took 3 weeks to find someone with a player that still worked. When they pressed play, the static came first. A hiss, a click silence. Then a voice. A woman. Calm, measured, American accent. Faint tremor in her words, like someone speaking in a room where she's not supposed to be. The words were not prayers, not sermons. They were a warning and a record. "If this is found," the voice said, "then we are gone." The sound of wind faint drifted through behind her, and the voice paused as if listening to someone approach. But nothing came. She continued. "This is Sister Maura Clark. I am recording this from the chapel above El Painal. I don't know how long we have before someone finds this room. But I need someone to know, not just what we saw, but what we were told not to see." The voice faltered, then catching not on fear, but something quieter, disbelief. "We were warned," she said, twice, maybe 3 times by villagers, not to return on December 2nd, not to take the usual route from the airport. But we did. Dorothy said, "If they want to kill us, at least let it be for doing what we came here to do." I wish I had argued harder. Silence again. A sound like a door creaking. Then the tape jumps. A cut. Time passes. When it resumes, her voice is lower, more urgent. The men weren't masked. That's what still wakes me up. They didn't even try to hide. They wore uniforms. One had a medal. I remember it catching the moonlight as he reached in. Jean was in the passenger seat. Dorothy said something in Spanish, trying to calm them. One of them laughed. The tape clicks again, more static. Then breathing steady close to the microphone. They separated us. They drove us down the coast. But I don't think it was random. They were waiting. They knew our route. They knew our names. And I think someone from the church told them. At that moment, the priest who played the tape the first time said the air in the room felt colder, though no windows were open, as if the walls themselves had drawn breath. Back on the tape, Sister Morris said something else. A name. But the tape cracked, distorted, rewound itself unnaturally, then stopped. They tried again. The tape would only play to that same point, then die. But the fragments were enough to reopen questions that had been buried for decades. How did the soldiers know exactly when and where the sisters would be? Why did only low-ranking guardsmen take the fall? And what name had Mora spoken right before the tape gave out? There were rumors, always had been, that a high official in the church had cooperated with the military, that someone in the archdiocese knew more than they admitted. But no one had ever had evidence, until now. The news of the tape spread slowly, not through headlines, not through official channels, but through whispers, among surviving missionaries, among locals who still remembered the nuns with the soft voices and the stubborn hearts, among those who had buried the memory because remembering was too painful or too dangerous. It reached Sister Cecilia first, now 77. Long retired, living quietly in Baltimore. She had known Dorothy personally, shared meals, laughed in the laundry room. She had received the last postcard Dorothy ever sent, dated 5 days before the disappearance, a simple note about a boy who had learned to tie his shoes. When she was told about the tape, she wept. Not for the horror. That had lived in her bones for decades. She wept because it meant someone hadn't forgotten. Someone had hidden that voice, protected it, across time, across war, across the efforts of silence. Then the call came from El Salvador. The current bishop, young untested, caught between duty and fear, authorized an inquiry. Quietly. No press. Just a small team handpicked a forensic analyst from Madrid, a Salvadoran historian, a Vatican archivist, and an interpreter trusted by survivors. They returned to the chapel where the tape had been found. The bricks were old, flaking. The air smelled of mildew and candle wax that had long since melted into memory. They opened the wall further. Nothing. Then checked the flan. There they found a rusted tin box sealed with cloth tape. Inside letters. Dozens, some in Jean Donovan's handwriting, some in Ida Ford's. A few unsigned. Many were unsent drafts, raw, emotional, dangerous. They come into the villages at night, one read. Ask about us, about who we talk to, about what we teach. I saw one of them watching the clinic from the trees. There's someone in the parish council, another said, who tells them when we leave, who we're with. We can't prove it, but we feel it. One letter ended with a line that chilled even the most seasoned investigator. If something happens to us, don't ask who killed us. Ask who watched and said nothing. And now, after 43 years, someone was asking. They combed the archives, reopened dusty boxes of testimony. They interviewed retired soldiers, men whose hands had trembled on their rosaries, even while pulling triggers. Some remembered, others refused. But one man, gaunt, shivering, long forgotten in a remote care home, gave them a name. He whispered it, as if afraid it would still reach the wrong ears. It was a name that matched what little could be salvaged from the damaged cassette, the same consonant, the same breath before it broke. A priest, a name never made public before. Not a stranger, not an outsider. Someone close. Trusted. His name had once been spoken with reverence, Father Esteban Caro, a man with a calm voice and soft hands who led prayers with eyes that never blinked too long. He had served under the Archbishop's office during the height of the conflict. He baptized children, delivered homilies, and as the records now suggested, attended private dinners with military officials, always after hours, always undocumented. No one had seen Father Esteban in years. He had disappeared sometime in the early 90s, citing health retreating into a remote monastery near Lake Ilopango. No press release, no formal retirement, just vanished as if into smoke. But now the name echoed first through whispered conversations inside the church, then across old alumni letters, then into the hands of investigators who had never even heard of him before the tape. The Vatican was briefed. Tension tightened across continents. The Bishop of San Salvador, only a boy when the nuns were murdered, issued a public request. Any individuals with knowledge related to the deaths of Sisters Clark Ford Cazell and lay missionary Donovan were asked to come forward under full ecclesiastical protection. But the silence stretched. Those who had served under Father Esteban were tight-lipped. Some said nothing. Others remembered small, strange things, meetings that ran too long, decisions that didn't feel right, confessions that were never written down. One nun recalled a day in late November 1980. Father Esteban had taken a call in the sacristy, then emerged pale. He canceled all upcoming parish visits for that week, claimed there had been a threat to the sisters' safety and that they would remain under God's protection only if they obeyed orders. The sisters never heard that warning. They went to the airport anyway. It was never just about politics, never just about violence. This was betrayal cloaked in faith. But it would take more than whispers to prove it. The investigator from Madrid, Elena Murillo, pushed deeper. She filed formal requests to the military archives, pressed the bishop to release internal correspondence from 1980. Eventually, she found a letter, dated December 1st, stamped by the church. It was addressed to Father Caro. The contents were brief, just 2 lines. The women arrive tomorrow. Route unchanged. May God grant you discernment. There was no signature, but the seal was real. It was not proof of murder, but it was enough to crack open the heart of the story. Now the truth had been hiding not in shadows, but in plain sight, in the very walls meant to protect, in the silence of pews that had seen too much, in the softness of prayers spoken by men who had learned how to keep secrets behind holy veils. When Sister Cecilia was shown the letter, she didn't cry. She folded her hands, looked to the sky, and simply whispered, "I knew it. I knew we weren't wrong to be afraid." The fallout began not with outrage, but with stillness, the kind that descends just before the thunder. A local paper in San Salvador published a small column titled "Letter Hints at Betrayal in 1980 Missionary Case." It was intended as a whisper, but by morning it had become a storm. Former students of the nuns, now grown, passed the link through WhatsApp and Facebook. Churches in Cleveland and Long Island rang bells for the first time in years. Old friends and parishioners held candlelight vigils under stained glass windows darkened by age. And then came the families. Jean Donovan's brother Tom flew down to El Salvador, shaking as he walked the dirt roads his sister had once driven. He hadn't been back since 1981. He never wanted to return. But the tape, the letters, the name, it had pulled him back. He sat in the chapel where the cassette was found. Alone, he touched the bricks that had kept her voice alive for 43 years. Then he broke not from anger, but from the simple ache of knowing that she had tried to warn the world, that she had spoken when she knew it might cost her life. She didn't die quietly, he later told reporters. She died still believing someone would care, that someone would listen. In Rome, the Vatican released a statement cautious but clear. The pain caused by the tragic loss of Sisters Maura Clark, Ida Ford, Dorothy Cazell, and Miss Jean Donovan must never be forgotten. If voices within the Church contributed to their suffering, we bear the weight of that sin with solemn reflection. No names were named. No apologies were issued. But the wall had cracked. The silence had been pierced. The Salvadoran Church, under pressure, commissioned an independent review of its role during the Civil War. Dozens of clergy were questioned. Some confessed, some denied. But all were finally forced to remember. And the man at the center, Father Esteban Caro, was located months later, frail, blind, and unwell, in a monastery hospital bed. When asked about the sisters, he didn't speak. He wept, then turned away facing the wall. No charges were filed. The statute of limitations had expired. The trail was too old, the evidence too thin. But the families didn't come for justice. They came for truth. But Sister Cecilia returned to El Salvador that winter. She walked the same roads the four had taken, stood at the airstrip, touched the crumbling walls of the mission house. At the site where their bodies had been found, she left 4 white lilies and a note written in blue ink. You were not forgotten. You are not alone. In that final act, something shifted. Not justice, not closure, but release. A lifting of the weight that had hung over so many for so long, and the weight of doubt, the fear that maybe it had all meant nothing, that their sacrifice had disappeared like their bodies once did into soil, into rumor, into the folds of a war that refused to speak its name. But now they had spoken, and the world had listened. The story didn't end in a courtroom. It didn't end in retribution. It ended in the way so many true stories do, quietly, with remembrance, with names being said out loud again in places where they were once forbidden, with faces being printed on candles, on stained glass, on murals painted across broken walls. In the spring following the tape's discovery, a group of young women students at a Catholic university in San Salvador launched a project called The Echoes. They traveled across rural towns with a simple mission to record the stories of people who had once known the sisters. They carried a phone, a journal, and an old tape recorder, symbolic now, no longer obsolete. They spoke to children who remembered being held by Jean, to mothers who recalled Ida arriving with medicine tucked under her robes, to farmers who had seen Maura's tears as she read names from a village census after soldiers passed through, to old women who still wore crosses that Dorothy had blessed with trembling fingers. The stories flowed like a river unclogged. In time, a second tape was discovered inside an old locker in the ruins of the mission clinic. This one wasn't hidden, just forgotten. Its label had faded, the ink long washed out by heat and rain. When restored, it revealed only 15 minutes of audio, the sound of laughter, of pots clanging, of women speaking softly in Spanish and English, translating prayers for children, singing along to a crackling radio. At the end of the tape, Jean's voice could be heard just above the hum. Even if we don't make it, even if no one ever hears this, I believe it's still worth it. Every second of it. Those words were broadcast at her memorial that year, projected against the walls of a rebuilt chapel where more than 200 people gathered. Families, nuns, survivors, strangers who had only read about the case weeks before. They came not just to mourn, but to witness. Because some disappearances do not end with a body found or a confession made. Some haunt us not because of how they ended, but because of how hard they tried to matter before they were taken. That is the wound that lingers, but also the seed. In Cleveland, a scholarship fund was started under Jean and Dorothy's names. In Nicaragua, a literacy center was renamed after Mora. In a quiet convent in San Salvador, Ita's handwritten notebooks were digitized and released online, her words now studied by girls she never got the chance to meet. Still, the most powerful legacy was this, that even in the face of a war meant to erase them, 4 women carved their presence so deeply into the people they served that it could never be fully buried. Not by time, not by fear, not even by silence. Stalkralmastal. And so when we look back on that December evening in 1980, when a white Jeep vanished into the dark and the world did what it always does to the brave, forget them too quickly, we must remember that somewhere, even then, a voice was speaking. Softly, secretly, recording what history would try to erase. Waiting behind a wall for someone to finally listen. Because sometimes the truth doesn't knock on the door. It waits sealed in brick and silence until the world is ready. And this time, we were ready.